So this is the basics of muzzle training. We'll start with the different types of muzzle. So this is the Baskerville Ultra muzzle. This suits dogs that have quite short snouts but are maybe a little bit wider towards the face. For example, Rottweilers or those larger bull breed type of dogs. We then move on to the regular Baskerville muzzle. This one doesn't have the inner bite guard because it makes it slightly easier for muzzle training. The benefit of this is you can remove the front of the muzzle as videoed, and it just helps with that treat delivery. You do need to file down those sharp edges though. This kind of muzzle would suit those dogs with a slightly longer, pointier snout that isn't as wide as those bull breeds would have. The other kind of muzzle that I have used is from a company known as the Muzzle Shop. This one does have a scavenger guard because it is designed for dogs that are muzzled purely for eating stuff off the ground that they shouldn't. I use this specific muzzle with one of my own dogs because it's quite light in weight, and I do tend to find that a lot of dogs prefer it to the other types of muzzle. These are the sort of muzzles I would not recommend for any sort of muzzle training because, as you can see, none of these dogs can open their mouth at all, so it is not appropriate for a dog to wear this sort of muzzle for a long time, so they wouldn't be able to exercise in it. Finally, there is a wire basket muzzle. This is a kind of muzzle I have not used before. They do look like they make for quite good muzzles to give treats through, but maybe for wearing for a little bit of a long time they might be a bit uncomfortable. When it comes to fitting a muzzle, they should be able to pant fully, which means they can open their mouth as wide as they would want to if they were panting when they're exercising. It also should not sit too close to the eyes. Make sure that the sides of the muzzle aren't digging into the face and that any straps behind the ears are sitting just below nice and comfortably and not going to irritate or rub. So for muzzle training we will need food. What food entirely depends on your dog's personal preference. So it's good to have a high value option. So for my dogs I'm going to use cheese, but you can use anything like chicken or turkey. A low value option, so for mine I'm just going to use their regular kibble. And a squeezy option, so this can just be blended meat or Primula cheese. You've then got the option of using a clicker when you want to mark when the dog has done something correct, or the option of a verbal marker such as the word yes. So this will be completely up to you and what you feel like your dog will prefer, whether it will be a clicker or just that verbal marker. So to get started you will need a well-fitting muzzle, so you can either measure your dog or just do a bit of trial and error if you can borrow any, and of course you will need your willing participant, which is your dog. And then the first step is you're literally just going to try and build that positive association with the muzzle. So any positive interaction that the dog has, you are going to reward them for that. So at this stage, anytime the dog does touch the muzzle, just make sure you are either clicking or marking with yes and then throwing those treats on the floor. Ideally, you would maybe start with the muzzle on the floor just so that you know that the dog is definitely understanding that it's touching this big red thing that's getting the food, but see what suits your dog best. The reason we're throwing the treats away from the muzzle is just so that they then have to choose to go back to it, and then that way you're pretty certain that they're getting that it's just touching that muzzle is what's getting them the food. If you were to just keep giving them the treats next to the muzzle, they might not necessarily understand the association. At this stage you can either be holding the muzzle in your hand or you can have it on the floor. It completely depends on what you feel your dog is going to pick up on quicker. Some dogs, if it's on the floor, are a bit more tempted to try and pick it up and play with it. Once you feel confident that the dog understands that just touching the muzzle is what's providing the food, you can place a few treats inside of it just to encourage them to put their nose in, and then start rewarding them through the holes in the muzzle. It's important to keep rewarding through the muzzle because this is where the treats are going to be coming from going forwards, especially once it is fully onto their face. You'll see she's at a bit of a weird angle here, so I do just toss a treat out of the way. Sometimes I'll do that to give me and the dog a bit of a break, and then when she comes back I can then realign her just so that it's a little bit easier. Once your dog's quite happy just placing their nose in the muzzle and taking treats through it, then the next step would be building up that duration. So this is literally the amount of time that we expect the dog to hold their nose in there until they get given the treat. So here I'm still using kibble with Lulu because this is motivating enough for her. You have got the option at this point to start using a squeezy tube if you want, so anything like that blended meat or a tube of Primula if that's appropriate for your dog. This can sometimes help just give them a little bit more of an incentive to keep their nose in there, but ideally I tend to prefer to teach them to just hold their nose in there and withhold that treat for initially just a second at a time and then gradually build up to 10 seconds if we can. You'll see that every so often she just puts her head above the muzzle just to see if she can get the treat without having to put her nose into it. I've just don't do anything in that moment, just try and re-lure her back into the muzzle just so that she's aware the treats only come through when the nose is in the muzzle. Each time before I give her the treat I'm just saying the word yes and then I give her the treat through the muzzle. So the footage here has been sped up slightly, but the goal that you'll be trying to achieve with your dog is just trying to see how long they can happily hold their nose in there for before you start moving on to that next step. This is a really important stage because when it gets to the point of us wanting to put this muzzle on just to go for a walk or something like that, ideally we want them to be able to hold their own nose into it whilst we fiddle about with straps and things, and then they get their reward. That way we're not bribing them into it the whole time, they are actually consenting to having it put on. Once you've got to the goal of your dog being able to hold their nose in there for 10 seconds, we would then move on to the next step, which is just to start introducing those straps. So you'll see in this part of the footage, I do start to just gently fiddle with one strap at a time. Her body language does then go to change because as soon as I touch it, she's like, oh, I'm not so sure now, you're starting to do something behind my ears, which is a completely normal reaction. The point here is to make sure that the dog understands we're not trapping them into it. So if there's any concerns, I just let go of the strap and then just go back a step. But here she's a little bit more tolerant now of me moving one of them around. The key with muzzle training is to take it at the pace that your dog is comfortable with. So she is quite a sensitive dog. So if I was to just quickly take my chance and try and do those straps up, yeah, she might tolerate it for that time, but then she won't be willing to do this with me again. So it is always good just to take that little bit of extra time. The goal we're trying to achieve here is that when you produce this muzzle in the future, they feel excited about seeing that as they would about their lead, because it only means great things, like in this example, food. I then go on to actually holding the straps behind her ears. I only do this for a few seconds at a time, and if there's any indication that she wants to back out, I would let go of those straps straight away, because again, what we're trying to achieve here is we're not trying to trick her into it or trap her. We're trying to teach her that this is the next step, this is something that we're just gradually going to get you used to, but we're going to do it at your pace. Once I felt like she was comfortable with me holding the straps behind her ears, I wanted to then move on to the next step. Unfortunately with her, I produced the squeezy tube, which is just some of that blended meat which I've squirted into there. She's got a little bit of a weird thing about these tubes, she's a bit scared of them, so in this scenario she decided to go and sit down, which is absolutely fine. What's really important is I'm not calling her to me, I'm not making a big deal out of it, I'm actually sitting here watching TV, and then I might just throw the odd treat on the floor just to remind her that I do actually have food, but it's completely up to her if she wants to engage with me or not. So she's showing me here that she's not sure, so I just go back right to basics and I just put it back on the floor and I'm just going, investigate that a minute, get your confidence back, which she does. She does start moving around, so then I offer to help her by holding it so that she can actually lick the stuff out of it easier. And then as I've given her this little bit of extra time, she doesn't feel like there's anything to worry about, so she decides to re-engage. So then we pick up where we left off. I'm just putting a few treats into the muzzle now, and then I'm actually going to do it up this time. She's only going to have it on for a few seconds while she gets her confidence up, and any food that has been dropped, I make sure I pick that up and I give that to her, because that's one of the main reasons that dogs start pawing at it straight away, if there's food on the floor that they realise the muzzle is preventing them from getting. And then I just take it off and I repeat again, and I'm going to keep repeating this until I feel she is comfortable. It's important as well to reward loads when the muzzle is actually on, because this is the most difficult phase for them, and this prevents them from trying to scratch it off if you keep giving them plenty of food. I then start moving around the room as well, because it's good to encourage them to move a short distance. Sometimes when dogs have muzzles on for the first time, they seem to not be able to function as they normally would, so a little bit of movement helps them with their confidence there. Once you feel like your dog is comfortably moving around in the house with the muzzle on, you can then take them outside. You can see here in this footage it is a different dog, but the premise is the same. So I am actually using a little bit of Primula for this dog because he tends to find this a little bit more high value and more interesting. And when we're outside, I'm just doing baby steps and just rewarding him for tolerating having the muzzle on. If at any point your dog does have a little paw at the muzzle, don't panic. Just see if you can lure them forward again and distract them with the food. If the pawing is excessive though, you may need to go back a step because it suggests that maybe they're not totally comfortable. But you should then end up with a dog that's quite happy to walk around with it on their face and be able to function as normal. So this includes being able to sniff and explore freely. For some dogs, the transition to outside makes it slightly easier because there's more to distract them. They're less focused on having the muzzle on their face. But for other dogs, it can actually be even harder. So this really depends on how well you know your dog and how you feel they're coping with it. If you feel like you need to spend more time inside getting your dog used to it, then that's not a problem at all. Or equally, maybe just stick to the garden for now, just somewhere where you know that the dog is comfortable. Just whilst they get used to this new sensation, because it is a bit weird for them. It affects everything. It affects how they smell, how they see, how they just function. It's worth noting with some muzzles, they do have a clip that has to be done up behind their ears. It's always good to get your dog used to this sound before it's actually done up behind their head, because this could put all of your hard work back. Hopefully this has been a helpful guide on just how to get started with muzzle training, but it's worth remembering all dogs are individuals and they're going to struggle with certain elements of it more than others. So if you do need any further support, just let me know and I can help you with your individual dog.